Hi, my name is Edward Watson. I'm a product marketing manager at Veeam Software, and I'm joined today by Stephen Hill, a senior analyst at 451 Research. And we're here today to talk about a new research paper you came out with around data growth, object storage capabilities with data protection and all that good stuff. So Stephen, how are you today?
I'm very good. Thank you for inviting me today. And yes, we did put together a really interesting paper. I work with one of my colleagues, Dan Thompson, who does a lot of our cloud coverage. And we collaborated on an interesting object storage piece because really object storage is probably one of the most relevant storage environments available today.
Stephen, why don't we dive into the top storage pain points that you discovered?
Yeah, and this is something that we've been following pretty consistently for a very long time. The typical problems that are always main considerations for companies are things like storage growth, because we've written this headline for a decade, 2 decades, is that storage growth is going to be crazy. We need to be able to deal with it. Ultimately, when we ask that question, there's 3 things that really come into play every time. 1 is storage growth and the cost. 2 is the security of that of that data, and 3 is finding ways of being able to use it effectively rather than just simply backing it up and archiving it somewhere.
And since we're on this topic of data growth, how much data are we actually talking?
Oh, the numbers are hard to imagine. I mean, we're seeing small companies that are having dozens or hundreds of terabytes, and large companies dozens or hundreds of petabytes of data. And a lot of this is information they've been gathering over time. A lot of this is new information that they've been collecting as part of this new IoT environment. This is something that's really dramatically affecting the amount of data growth. And there's just so many sources. So the challenge for companies is to be able to not only economically manage that storage, but to make use of it over the long term.
Sure, and I suppose now with emerging compliance concerns as well, they probably play quite a bit of a role as well in how we feel about data growth.
Absolutely. If you look at the GDPR, the General Data Protection rules of the EU, this is the first of what I believe will be many different legal actions to be able to protect consumer information. California passed a CCPA, which is theoretically going to go into effect in 2020, and it's the first time that we're seeing serious penalties for not managing your data properly. And we've been collecting data on everything. I mean, every week on the news you hear about a new intrusion or a data spill or the improper use of information. And ultimately, I think that worldwide we're going to see much, much tighter controls over that, which means that companies will need to be able to comply with those laws. There's some that have been doing it for years, education and healthcare. So it's just going to happen on a much more generalized basis.
Sure, so it is clear there are plenty of challenges, and certainly there are more tools in the toolbox, so to speak, than ever. And although object storage isn't necessarily something that's new, it's probably more relevant now than it ever has been in terms of addressing those challenges.
Absolutely, never as important as it is right now. We're talking about a very hybrid environment that's growing around us. Ultimately, we're learning that technology doesn't have to be locked into a data center to be of value. And slowly but surely, people are moving their data to other locations for whatever reason. The problem is keeping track of that data no matter where it is. This is where objects' metadata capabilities become a powerful tool for being able to monitor that data, to track where it's going, to establish its relative value, and establish common policies that can be followed regardless of where that data may reside. Hybrid cloud is just making it more flexible, but with flexibility comes a little bit of complexity, and that's where object storage can really make a big difference in the future.
So in terms of adoption of object storage in the market, what are you seeing as far as adoption? What's driving adoption?
Well, the interesting thing is that there's a lot of people who are using object that don't even think about it. When you talk about the cloud, I would, and they don't publish numbers, but I'm assuming that the vast majority of data stored in the cloud is stored on object storage in things like Amazon S3, Microsoft's blob storage for Azure, Google has object storage, and almost every vendor across the board has an object storage play. partially because it's really the ideal platform for the 21st century. Because again, it comes to control, management, and visibility, and this is where object storage really shines. Plus, object has theoretically limitless scalability. If you look at S3, I'm guessing they have exabytes of data stored on S3. With resilience, I'm thinking in terms of 12 nines, which are numbers that are way beyond what expectations are for almost any other storage platform. So when you combine the ability to store things in multiple locations with unlimited scalability, with on-demand pricing, object storage becomes more and more the ideal solution, especially as data moves downstream and still has importance, but it just doesn't merit spending a lot of money to store it. And that's where the efficiencies of object come in.
Definitely, definitely. Now, in terms of taking a tiered approach to object storage, there's obviously a method of tiering that organizations can now leverage with object storage and should be thinking about. What's your take on tiering methods together with object storage?
Well, typically tiering was done based on the most basic information. If you look at file data, the only real information to have is a file name and a date and the size of the file, and that's really not very useful in terms of understanding that data. So the only tools that we have presently are when was it last used, when was it accessed, when was it created. Ultimately, object gives you more capabilities because of the metadata, so you can establish criteria that's more important for your business. Does it have personal information in it? Because PII, as I mentioned earlier, is a real issue. Does it have intellectual property that needs to be protected? Does it have to be data that is on hold for litigation and for e-discovery? The list goes on, and object storage gives you the flexibility to do that because it gives you custom metadata that can be attached to data. And again, it becomes the abstraction of object makes it so flexible that object storage can be whatever you want it to be. And we're no longer talking about slow object storage, because that was when it was first. Right. It was like, oh, that's archive, and that's the reputation problem that object is going over. But if you look at, I would say a large majority of the supercomputer environments today are based on object storage. If you look at things like Amazon S3 that are multi-exabytes in size, those are dependent on object storage purely because that abstraction gives you the flexibility to do way more than anything we had up till that point.
And Stephen, I'm wondering how software management platforms as kind of the data movers for tiering backup files to object storage, what's your perspective on that and the role those data movers play?
Becoming more and more important. Part of the interesting thing about object is that you don't necessarily have to move data when you want to make some of these adjustments. Sometimes it's just a matter of moving the metadata itself. So that takes literally no time by comparison to the data. Again, an object environment is not focused on where the data is, but what the data is. It's what I would call the new information age of storage. Being able to move data is something that should be seamless and in the background, and that's part of some of the capabilities of the newest storage environments. Some of them are based on object abstraction anyway, because they're writing to, say, multiple nodes. So this is where moving this data around internally isn't as hard. And then the next step is externalizing that. So this is why I love the cloud as a data protection model, because you can put stuff out in the cloud, take advantage of its flexibility, virtually unlimited scalability, right, and this resilience at 12 nines. Plus, it doesn't matter. You might want to be able to utilize this data in a number of locations. You don't have to make duplicate copies of that. You just point to the data, and object gives you the capabilities to be able to run multiple workloads using the same data. So it saves a lot of problem in that regard. From a backup perspective, and I always talk to the restoration challenge, because everybody does backup, but restoring it is something you hope you never have to do. And that's where some of these things become a challenge as well, is that if you're talking about true disaster recovery, the cloud is ideal because it's geographically separated, it's available practically anywhere you have a connection, and it gives you a model that both data and workloads can reside on until you can come back to normal production. So the cloud and backup, the cloud and disaster recovery, business continuity is a perfect match.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Really do appreciate you joining us. If you hadn't heard, Veeam came out with our native integration with object storage, which includes tiering, offloading backups to Amazon S3, Azure Blob Storage, IBM Cloud, as well as S3 compatible service providers. So you can learn more at veeam.com.